Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Peter Sarris. Peter is professor of Late Antique, Medieval, and Byzantine Studies at the University of Cambridge. He is widely published in the field. He's written some popular pieces as well. He's also the author or editor of at least 8 books on the history of late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and he is the author of the new book, Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. As I say in the conversation, fabulous book. This book was fabulous. I did not know a lot about Justinian, and more so as a kind of here's another ruler in a long series of rulers. And so to really isolate on one was really wonderful, and I really appreciated how much the writing is very clear and really gives you a sense of the importance of Justinian. We talk about the overview of Justinian's life. We talk about the context of the Roman Empire, pre-Justinian era. We talk about the rise of Justin, who was before him, and how he adopted Justinian, and then Justinian becoming the ruler. We talk about lessons Justinian learned from Justin, some of the urgency and energy in the early Justinian period, and the amount of religious law he invoked. Talk about the importance of Armenia at this time, the zealous nature of Justinian having religious laws and enacting on them. Talk about Hagia Sofia and his building various places around the region, and many of the religious propaganda that he promoted, his military campaigns, how his laws took effect later in his life, and what the impact was there. Talk about some of the dynamics with his wife and how important she was, not just for him personally, but also as a type of co-ruler. Talk about how he handled pandemic and disease at the kind of later stages of his reign, and a little bit of his death, and then the legacy of Justinian, and really his commitment to his religious beliefs and trying to instantiate that within law. Whether you agree or disagree, he's an important figure for kind of the spread and the institutionalization of Christianity, probably at that time, and subsequent decades and centuries after. So he's an important figure to know and understand, and I really found him a fascinating character. And Peter does such a nice job of bringing him to life and making him kind of out of textbooks or history books or things like that, and making him a real life person and a lot of complexity. And so it was absolutely wonderful talking to Peter, who's obviously quite brilliant and just absolutely wonderful to chat with. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So follow, share, feel free to contribute if you so feel like doing that. That always helps. Appreciate that. You can also find the podcast on YouTube if that's where you listen. And just share it widely for those that you think would be interested. And now I bring Peter Sarris. I'm here with Peter Sarris. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've been greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Same here. No, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. You've written an excellent book. I saw it and I said, I want to read this, and then I read it, and I was very, very pleased. It's well written, really, really good book all around. The book is Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint, and it's about the life of Justinian. For listeners, tell folks what your kind of professional and academic background is, and what you currently do, and what you're currently up to.
So I'm currently professor of late antique, Byzantine and medieval studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And I've been there for just over 20 years. Before that, I trained as a medieval and Byzantine historian in Oxford. There's a big centre for Byzantine research. And periodically over the years, I've spent quite a lot of time in the US. There's a big center in my subject at Dumbarton Oaks out in Georgetown in Washington. I always try to make sure I spend a chunk of the year out there doing research and burying myself in the library. So I work across the field of Byzantine and medieval history, but my main focus and my real preoccupation has always really been the East Roman Empire in the 6th century, in the age of Justinian, and that's what I've written this book about.
I didn't know you were over here in my neck of the woods. I live just outside DC, so that's nice to know.
Yeah, the whole of July, so I was there this summer, and it's
oh, very nice. Oh, you're here in the worst month. You're here when it's super hot and humid.
Libraries, it means I get my work done.
I guess I'm just curious. Sometimes people fall into these things. Sometimes it's by choice or more directed. But why that specific time period and area of the Byzantine or Roman Empire? This kind of 6th century. How did you fall into that? I mean, it's not a very long, period of an empire. But why that period did you choose to kind of park there?
Well, in a sense, it was almost random. When I first began my degree in Oxford back in the early 90s, and in the UK we specialise in our undergraduate degrees, the first paper I had to study was on the emergence of society in post-Roman Britain. So the first thing I had to look at was the demise of Roman power in the West and the emergence of post-Roman societies, first of all in Britain, and then across the continent in the West as well. And that brought me into contact with Justinian and the Eastern Roman Empire. And it struck me that at the time we were still very much taught that period, that transition from Roman rule, as a sort of a narrative of inevitable decline. And what was interesting about Justinian when I encountered him was that in many respects, the history of his reign undermined that narrative, because here was a period when the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire in the East, as I say, was resurgent. It was conquering new territory. It seemed to be on the up again. And I found that fascinating. And I was lucky that because at school and from my personal background, I had quite a lot of Greek, I studied quite a lot of Latin, that transition to move eastwards and to look at what was going on in Constantinople in the East was a relatively straightforward one for me. But in a sense, I'm really sort of still pursuing ideas and questions I first encountered in my first term, really, as an undergraduate quite a long time ago.
This is very, very interesting. So, Justinian, again, I'm no expert on any of this stuff. Is this a kind of like a redress of him and his legacy? When was the last time, I guess, for like a general kind of audience, was there something on Justinian? I guess just again on your end of things, where do you see this book in terms of audience and how it's going to get out there for people of what it is to say about Justinian?
On Justinian, the last time we had a full history of his reign written in English is just over 25 years ago. It's about a generation ago when we had studies by Evans in Canada and Moorhead in Australia. Both wrote studies at around the same time. But those studies in many ways took their lead from our chief contemporary historian of the age of Justinian, the historian Procopius, who was quite anti the emperor and didn't really share his policy agenda. And I think that there's always been a problem with Justinian, that we've tended to view him through the lens of Procopius. And what I found more and more looking at the emperor was that people weren't really getting the emperor's agenda, what preoccupied him, and what his chief priorities were. And what I'm trying to do is give more of a sense of what mattered to Justinian and to try to look at his reign in the round. Justinian tends to be studied from a legal perspective by lawyers, from a theological perspective by theologians, and from a military perspective by a lot of particularly English-speaking historians. And what I try to do in this study is draw all of those aspects together and, as I say, try to see the world of the 6th century in terms of what mattered most to Justinian. Now, to Justinian, warfare mattered, sure. But from even before he becomes emperor, he is fascinated by, preoccupied with issues of Christian doctrine. is clearly fascinated with the law and is ready, has a massive legal agenda, as we're ready to go the moment he comes to the throne. And I think sort of trying to draw those aspects together and get his list of priorities right is central to what I was trying to do in this book, which I hope I've managed to convey to the reader.
110%. I mean, the book is a kind of a masterclass in presenting the kind of gestalt of the whole person. It's the whole psychological profile of Justinian. I finished reading this book and I felt like I felt cheated. I said, why have I not heard about this guy in this kind of way? I mean, it was a very complete picture. You get the very full profile of him. Very, very readable. I mean, people kind of get nervous with history because it's dates and facts, and there's certainly that in there. But it really, I got a sense of his temperament and his personality. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me about him was how, what's the word? Spiritual is not the word, but it's somewhere in there where it's more of, yes, I mean, he was always very religious and the legal components, but there was this almost this mystical aspect of how much he really cared about Christendom and what he was up to and how important that was. That really kind of laid an imprint on me. I mean, all the other stuff is great too, but that was, I don't know, it just felt very different in the way in which you described it and talked about it, kind of was resounding. So yeah, it was well done.
I think it's very easy for us to assume that rulers are only interested in religion from a very utilitarian perspective. They're trying to use it to achieve their ends by other ends, as it were, through the means of religion. And of course, there's an element to that. A lot of Justinian's religious agenda will be pursuing other political aims as well. But here is someone who, as I say, from long before his emperor, we can show is sort of genuinely interested in the intricacies of doctrine in a way that's often quite alien to the modern mindset. And it's part of that aspect which I think comes across. Justinian's unusual in that if we draw all these types of evidence together, we can actually get a sense of his character, of this workaholic, micromanaging, obsessive, constantly impetuous character who's rushing everybody on, even when it isn't always in his interest, although in the interest of his subjects.
Yeah. That certainly shines through. So it was really seeing him in a new light. So it's great. So why don't you just kind of parachute us in to the context here? So we talk about the rise of Justinian. So maybe just a little bit of some backdrop there. I mean, obviously Augustus is an important early figure. The Roman Empire is centuries long. There was the rivalry with Persia, the rule of four, all these things. But how are all of these components kind of an important backdrop that gets us to the Roman Empire in the early 6th century?
So as you say, I mean, the origins of the imperial office, which Justinian inherited, and he has a strong historical sensibility and understands, or tries to understand, his place in history. As you say, go back to Augustus in the 1st century, and this world in which a single Roman emperor resident in Rome ruled this vast domain extending from Britain to Egypt and Syria. But crucially, in the 3rd century, this unified Roman Empire, dominated by the figure and the image of the emperor in Rome, came under very considerable simultaneous military threats from both north and east. And from the east in particular, by virtue of the sudden emergence of an aggressive new superpower rival in the form of the Sasanian Empire of Persia. Now, what we see in response to that is that the old system centered on the city of Rome and the model of one emperor breaks down, and we see the emergence of a more devolved imperial system, whereby you will have one emperor resident primarily in the east to face down the Persians, and one in the west to face down the northern barbarians, with each of these having a deputy. This is the rule of four that you refer to, the so-called tetrarchy, that takes shape under Diocletian in the late 3rd, early 4th century. Now, what's really important here as background to Justinian is that because the Sasanians are regarded as the most dangerous foe, because the Sasanians are regarded as the most prestigious foe, ruling over a great empire and claiming universal domination, the senior emperor, Diocletian and thereafter, tends to be based in the east to face them down. So we see the shift in the center of gravity and authority eastwards in the Roman world. And that then gets consolidated, as it were, in stone when Constantine builds his new imperial center at Constantinople and bases himself in the east. So crucial background for Justinian is that shift eastwards. And then in the 5th century, the fragmentation and then effective disappearance of the Western Roman Empire as mounting military pressure in the West leads to the breakdown of the imperial system there. So you end up in a situation by the late 5th century whereby there's been a shift in the center of gravity of the Roman world eastwards, but then the Western Empire has fragmented and disappeared, effectively leaving just the emperor in Constantinople in place. And what's crucial to Justinian is an awareness in imperial circles and the circles in which he is raised in particular of this lost world, this sense that a universal Roman dominion has been in the West, including the West, has been lost, and that core heartlands of the empire in Italy, in Africa, in Gaul and elsewhere have been lost to direct imperial rule and are now ruled over by barbarians. And in particular, by barbarians who, from the perspective of Constantinople and this empire, which since the age of Constantine has been becoming increasingly Christian, barbarians who are regarded as heretical. They are followers of a form of Christianity which the imperial church had denounced from the late 4th century onwards. And these facts, combined with a sudden revival of warfare with Persia just prior to Justinian's reign, lead to an intense sense of insecurity and uncertainty and political crisis in imperial circles, to which Justinian will attempt to respond in the course of his reign.
Yeah, you set that up very nicely. It gives a kind of context of the environment in which the world is, this part of the world. So he has this uncle, which you talk about in the first part of the book, Justin, and he has a rise to power, and there's a way in which he ruled, which you can tell us about. And then, I guess importantly, he comes to adopt Justinian. So maybe talk a little bit about his uncle Justin and how he ruled, and this whole adoption process of what happened and why him and how that came about.
Yes, Justinian's rise to power was really largely due in its first stages to his uncle Justin, as you say. Now, importantly, the family came from the Western Balkans, in what's now southern Serbia, in what in a 5th and early 6th century context would really have been thought of as the sort of the empire's Wild West. This had always been an impoverished region of the Roman world, one of the least urbanized, least civilized parts of it. And in the mid-5th century in particular, around the time that Justin would have been born, it had been subjected to devastating barbarian attacks at the hands of groups such as the Huns. And when Justin was born in the mid-5th century, it probably wasn't clear to what extent this region was even under Roman rule. There's probably much more of a sort of bitterly contested no man's land over which no one authority really held effective sway. Anyway, this is an impoverished landscape. Justin is raised in poverty. We're told by a later source that the young man works as a swineherd. And in order to escape the poverty of his upbringing and improve his lot, around the year 470, so when he's about 20 or so, Justin and a couple of friends began the long march east to Constantinople, which would have taken them about a month, heading to Constantinople in the hope of being recruited into the Roman army and forging a career for themselves. So Justin and his two friends arrive in Constantinople, but crucially they arrive in Constantinople at a moment when the arrangements for the palace guards are being dramatically overhauled. You want your palace guardsmen to be good fighters, good at defending the emperor, but you also want them to be physically imposing and impressive to look at. And Justin, we're told, and his two friends were tall, they were good looking, they catch the eye of the recruiting sergeant, and they're signed up. And this then begins Justin's advance. He probably gets an education from the army. He has a career in the palace, but also as a fighting soldier. And he progressively advances through the ranks until, by the time he's quite an old man, he ends up in charge of one of the two key guards units guarding the palace in very close proximity to the emperor. During the course of that career, he also marries. And it's interesting that although he'd have been well placed to find himself quite an aristocratic bride through his connections at court, instead he seems to marry for love. So we know that he marries this woman who is a former slave girl, with whom he forms a lasting bond, and who he will eventually take with him into the palace. And they clearly have a very happy marriage, but they don't have children. Justin is very family-minded. He maintains connection with his family back home in the Western Balkans. And so he seems to write to his sister, who has a son, Petrus, saying, send the boy to Constantinople, I'll look after him, I'll make sure he has a good life. And so Petrus, the future Emperor Justinian, is sent to Constantinople, I think probably when he's about 8 years old. And there he's educated by Justin, he's raised by him. Justin arranges for him too to be recruited into the palace guard, and he ends up adopting him as his son. We don't know exactly when the adoption happens, but it has happened by the time of a crucial development around the year 518, when Justin, as I say, is one of the two heads of the palace guard. At that point, the reigning emperor Anastasius dies without really having made proper arrangements for his succession, and you get this power struggle at court with different aristocratic factions vying for control, and eventually they agree on Justin as a new emperor, as a sort of compromise candidate, assuming he's an old man, he won't be around for too long. This, for Justin, is the second great break. The first is being adopted by his uncle in Constantinople. The second is his uncle becoming now emperor. And Justin Justinian's advance now through the upper echelons, initially making him a general. And then we see Justin beginning to machinate in his own interest and advance himself at court until about the year 525. He's appointed Justin's deputy. And then in 527, as Justin is ailing, about 5 months before the emperor dies, he's made co-emperor. So Justinian has, as it were, two great breaks of luck, but he also contributes to that luck himself. He is involved in some of the machinations to get Justin made emperor in 518 when he's in the palace guards, and he spends a lot of time while his uncle is emperor building up a support base for himself in the church, in the army, and on the streets of Constantinople.
So a few questions here. If Justin was, had a really nice, loving relationship with his wife, and he wanted kids, was it, and maybe we don't know, but was it a choice that he didn't have kids of his own with her? Was it some type of infertility kind of thing, or it's just unclear?
I think it's unclear. I think the safest thing to assume is that they tried and they couldn't do it. It didn't work out for them.
Yeah. And so I guess this whole thing about, I know different periods of history, different empires do different things. This idea of succession, was this idea kind of the second part of luck? So the first part of, is Justinian becomes adopted, which is very lucky. But the second piece is, what is it about him being the successor? Was it, well, that's the only adopted son and that's it? Or was there a kind of process for succession as emperor? And how did the public receive that, if that all that mattered?
I think it's important that Justin doesn't immediately appear to have had any plans to automatically make Justinian his heir to the throne or successor. He's quite careful early on in his reign not to be seen to overload Justinian with honours. Yes, he makes him a general, but he makes a general of the army in the near vicinity of Constantinople. But at the same time, he gives the same position to another very well-regarded character called Vitalian, who has a lot of support in Constantinople and would have been regarded by many as a very good successor to the throne. He does give Justinian the office of consul in 522. That's a very important position which can be used to project one to a more successful, more high. It can be used as it were, a springboard to the imperial office. But he's very careful, as I say, not to be seen to line up Justinian too readily. And we're told by one source that Justinian's allies in the Senate lobby Justin early on to have Justinian appointed co-ruler. And Justin says, no, I'm really not sure about this. He's too young. And so there's a certain... It's always dangerous if you're emperor if there's too obviously an heir lined up to succeed you, because that then makes you more readily disposable.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
And Justin is quite good at keeping himself on the throne in quite difficult circumstances. So I think he only really, he draws closer to Justinian and starts to draw him more closely in line to succession after two developments. I think one is the death of his wife, on whom he's very dependent, around the year 522, and then after around the year 525, when maybe he's already ailing and is starting to be more anxious about the succession to him. But it's I say that the position of heir is something which Justinian and his allies are lobbying Justin to line him up for, but it's not an automatic process.
That's very important. I'm glad you mentioned that. So this aspect of him being a high-ranking military post, the consul, and he's in and around Constantinople, which is obviously the center of things. How did this whole upbringing and how he was positioned and how he was doing all these things while Justin was still emperor, how much of an impact did this have? Because if I remember correctly, you say in the book that his uncle does it one way, and there was a lot of observing and a lot of things he was learning and trying to understand. So that way, when he is finally made emperor, he's already, or not already, but he's got a really good idea based on the things he had done of how he wants to do it and how he wants to do it in a particular way. Because I guess in terms of his formation and this in being in Constantinople, in the military with the consul, how did these things kind of shape the kind of um, worldview or the framework of how he wanted to reign eventually?
Well, I think his time as a general is probably more important than is sometimes supposed.
Mm.
As I say, he's made a general of the army outside Constantinople, the so-called Presental army, by Justin. We have no evidence of Justinian as a fighting soldier, but he is probably from that point on, and I think almost certainly from 525, when he's made deputy emperor or Caesar, involved in the formation of imperial strategy. So I think that starts locking him into, as it were, how he thinks about the empire's military priorities and the military threats. His period as general is also really important because it's probably during that period that he talent spots two individuals who will be crucial to his period of active rule, his period of emperorship. John the Cappadocian, a ruthless tax collector, who he will appoint as his chief minister, and who, as I say, he first seems to encounter when he's a general, and crucially Belisarius, a fellow Balkaner, as it were, a young man from the Balkans, who is made one of Justinian's military entourage, and who, when he's emperor, he will appoint as one of his most trusted generals. Those are connections he forges when he's a general. He's also involved in the Emperor Justin's attempts to draw closer politically and theologically to the papacy in Rome. This is going to be a very important theme, again, of Justinian's reign, how one deals with the papacy, how one deals with the theological disputes of the day. And as you say, he's observing how the court works, and he uses the office of consul in particular to buy up support. The consul, during the course of his year in office, was allowed to distribute the so-called consular largesse, vast sums in gold and presents and gifts, which he would circulate amongst the population of Constantinople. We're told that Justinian's consular celebrations were the most spectacular anybody could remember. This was a deliberate effort on the part of Justinian to buy up support amongst the different political components of society in Constantinople, ready for his move into power. But he's also observing, as you say, how his uncle reigns. Justin, despite some of the coverage we have against him, wasn't a particularly active emperor, but nor was he a particularly lazy one. The legislation we have issued under his reign bears comparison to that of his successors. But Justinian was clearly increasingly irritated by what he perceived to be the slow pace of reform and legislation under his uncle, such that when he is made co-emperor with his uncle, we have a sudden explosion of legislation, which is clearly driven by Justinian and his sense of the agenda that is needed in Constantinople in the imperial palace at that moment in time.
So bring us to, so you're kind of getting us there. So to bring us to where he becomes emperor, and he's reigning, and you mentioned that he had this type of energy and this kind of creativity. Again, he kind of different from his uncle. I guess what was it in the beginning when he first gets there of like, what were his major motivations? Because he does have this emphasis on religious administration, which I'm sure we'll get to. But in the beginning, and with this energy, and he's new there, and he's been observing things for a bit. What was his kind of motivations in the beginning of his reign?
Well, I think there's a strong sense that comes across from his legislation of his frustration. I think one gets a sense, as I say in the book, of him being a sort of a middle-aged man in a hurry once he gets and he's desperate to get his hands on the reins of power at last. Um, and he constantly goes on about what he regards as the indolence of his predecessors on the throne, be it in the field of military activity or the law or theology. This theme comes up. His main preoccupations are religion, cracking down on pagans and others who he regards as a cause of moral pollution in the capital. This is a very strong theme. The early 6th century is a period of very intense apocalyptic expectation in some Christian circles, and a sense of divine judgment being imminent. It's possible that Justinian is to some extent influenced by this, and he has this determination perhaps that he has to ensure that the souls of his subjects are ready for divine judgment, and that requires the emperor to crack the whip in terms of their moral improvement. So cracking down on religious minorities, a very marked priority from the moment he comes to the throne. Upgrading defences with Persia, a very major priority, the early 6th century having witnessed a resurgence of Roman-Persian warfare. And also, I think, initiated very early on major legal reform, not just in terms of this huge outpouring of legislation, which marks the first 8 years of his reign, but also a concerted effort which he starts putting into effect from very early on to start to codify the inherited body of Roman law. The problem of Roman law being when Justinian comes to power that so many laws have been issued by emperors. There are so many different sources of law in the Roman system, such that the opinions of legal scholars can be cited in court. It's become very difficult to work out what the law on any particular issue is. Justinian is determined to sort this out by imposing much greater clarity and order on the legal system upon which the administrative system of the empire more generally depends. But those are his three occupations: getting ready for war, getting ready for judgment and cracking down on religious dissent, and imposing order on the body of the law.
So I want to come to the legal aspects, but before we do, I'm curious. I had this conversation with Adrian Goldsworthy. He has a book out on Roman Persia, and he talks about their rivalry for 700 years, and it's I don't know how he wrote all of that history in 400 pages. It's so incredible how he did all that. It's a great book. And this came up there. I'm curious from I guess the angle or the perspective of Justinian. How did Justinian handle Armenia with the Persians? So I talked about in this conversation, but for listeners, you have the Roman Empire, and then you have the Persian Empire, or the coming Persian Empire, and very, very formidable. And there was this period there were periods of, yes, some conflict, but then also periods where they kind of were able to kind of co-mingle or cohabitate, the region, okay, wasn't conflictual per se. So there's all these ebbs and flows over time. But sandwiched in between these two empires is Armenia, which isn't a region that is pretty independent. There these kind of independence of the region, which is fascinating. And how did Justinian kind of handle Armenia, with the Persians during his reign early on?
Yes, the issue with Armenia is you have as it were, a direct Roman-Persian frontier, which, if you think about it in terms of being the frontier between Syria and Iraq today, isn't entirely correct, but isn't 100% wrong. I think that's a good way to think about it. Control of that frontier can be achieved by mastery of the Caucasus to the north, with Armenia at its heart, or the desert frontier to the south. Now, in terms of that direct Roman-Persian frontier in Syria, the Persians and the Romans don't really have, by the 6th century, much by way of territorial ambitions at each other's expense. The Sasanian Persians will typically raid into Roman territory for booty and to as it were, to enhance the prestige of the ruling Persian emperor, the ruling Shah. This is what's often termed prestige-garnering warfare. The one area where the two empires have really significant territorial clashes is Armenia. The point being that the most important economic heartlands of the Sasanian Empire are in Iraq, and they're very vulnerable to attack from the mountain passes that run from north to south in the Caucasus. And the Roman territories on the Anatolian plateau are also very vulnerable to the east-west marches across the valleys of Armenia. So each empire could be thinking defensively, but when thinking defensively, that will want to strengthen themselves at the expense of the other in Armenia. This is why Armenia is always a flashpoint. During the warfare that occurs in the early 6th century, the Persians have launched an unprovoked attack from a Roman perspective on the Eastern Roman Empire in Syria, primarily advancing initially through Armenia. So Armenia is very much in the mind of Justinian and those around him. And what we see him doing is three things, really. First of all, he establishes a new military commander in the region, a new general, the Magister Militum per Armeniam, in order to oversee Roman military operations. And he gives that man an army made up of a proper Roman army, made up of Roman recruits. Hitherto, the Romans in the region have been primarily dependent on the military levies of the local Armenian nobility, who could be unreliable. He also tries to integrate the Roman territories of Armenia more fully into the administration of the empire, making those territories more like every other province, again, by undermining the power of the great Armenian noble families. He also attempts to bolster the Roman position in the Caucasus more generally through a program of missionary diplomacy, establishing, first of all, imperial Christianity in frontier zones around Armenia and the other Caucasian kingdoms, such as Lazica, which he's brought in, but Sanica along the Laz border. And then once Christian missionaries are there, putting boots in on the ground by sending Roman troops in to consolidate rule there. So you have a combination in the Caucasus of military strategy, religious strategy, and, as I say, an attempt to claw these territories and incorporate them more fully into the empire. And it's a strategy which is pretty effective, as we see in terms of subsequent resistance to Roman attacks on Roman territories in Armenia from Perse Armenia in the years that follow.
Well, it's something that, again, you're talking about this frontier. I mean, it's whether they like it or not, Armenia becomes a critical space, especially when you have another big empire on the other side of things. So it's a very interesting space. Just as a footnote here, I had a lovely conversation with Jacob Mikanowski, who's a writer. He wrote this book recently on Eastern Europe. And he talks about many different countries, like Romania and Moldova. And he talks about some of the Caucasus states. And he goes, yeah. He's like, I didn't talk about Armenia too much in the book. He's like, because they're just very complicated. He's like they currently are. He was like, they've kind of maintained a lot of their kind of independence, and there's less like admixture, and then other ways there is. He's like, it's just and then he made this comment of. He's like, and this is kind of true historically too, from what I understand. Like, it's just for a while, this region, I think also because of the terrain is a little bit different. There's a lot of mountain regions, things like that. So it's just Armenia is a very fascinating place in terms of our anthropology and our history and things like that for many, many centuries now.
And they're a cause of instability in relationships between the great powers, not just in terms of the ambitions of the powers, but their own ambitions. And that the Armenians have a vested interest in playing the Romans and the Persians off against each other in order to maximize their autonomy. And that's another element of fluidity in superpower relations in this period.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So let's talk about some of the legal components here. So why? I mean, I know it's not the only way, but why was Justinian was pretty tough on using many legal laws to crack down on paganism, elevating Christianity. He wanted to overhaul this legal education in the empire. Why was he so? I mean, is it fair to say he was zealous about Christianity and then wanted to put his money where his mouth was and said, "Hey, we're going to do this legally as well and crack down on paganism." And so I guess why that kind of approach? And then second to that is how much of that kind of push really expedited the way in which Christianity kind of spread and was instantiated within Europe and in certain regions of Europe that we see later on in centuries later.
I think there are the two aspects here. If you bear with me, I'll take the second part of your question first.
Yeah, please.
Since the early 6th century, emperors in Constantinople had become increasingly alert to the extent to which missionary activity, the proselytization of the imperial form of Christianity beyond the empire's frontiers, could be used in order to draw neighboring peoples into the political orbit of Constantinople. We start seeing a growing sort of politicization of Christian missionary activity. So in the early 6th century, the imperial authorities had gone to great efforts to draw the Franks into the embrace of the imperial church by adopting what we would call Catholic Christianity, Christianity in its imperial form. Earlier in the reign of Justin, concerted efforts have been made to use Christianity in the Caucasus, imperial Christianity in the Caucasus in that way, and also in southern Arabia in order to extend imperial influence. Now, under Justinian, we see that policy being pursued very concertedly, again, in the Caucasus and in the Balkans and Central Europe as a Christian missionary activity for imperial political purposes, as well as fundamentally religious ones. That's going to be very important in terms of the spread of the imperial form of Christianity. In terms of the subsequent history of the imperial or Catholic form of Christianity, it's also going to be very important that Justinian's armies will destroy the two main kingdoms associated with the main non-Catholic form of Christianity, the so-called Arian form of Christianity, in terms of the Ostrogoths and the Vandals. We'll set that aside. We'll probably come back to them later. Within the empire, Justinian's line is the previous emperors had legislated against pagans, of course, in theory, but they've never really done it in practice. Yeah. And this is always his complaint. This, again, is part of his complaint about indolence. Again, they had legislated against heretics in theory, those whose definition of the faith was deemed to be erroneous by the imperial church, but they never really moved against them sufficiently in practice. What we see early in Justinian's reign is an attempt to use the law and use legal officers and to use officers of the church to actually put these laws into effect and make the laws more draconian. So previous emperors had issued legislation against pagan rites, pagan practices. Justinian, for the first time, makes it illegal even to be a pagan. Pagans are to convert, go into exile, or if they only pretend to convert, they are to die. This is the most extreme anti-pagan legislation any Christian emperor had ever passed, and we have evidence in certain localities, at least, of it being put into effect. So this is very important. Also, Justinian applies steady downward pressure on the legal status of other minority religious groups. Roman law had been quite protective of the legal status of the emperor's many Jewish subjects. Justinian removes quite a lot of that legal cover and starts once again imposing quite severe legal penalties on his many Jewish subjects. This is quite ominous for his Jewish subjects in much of the Roman Near East. Also, there's a concern for personal morality, which goes well beyond what any previous emperor had done. Justinian's the first emperor to persecute men for having sex with men. This is a very important feature as well. So we see an attempt not just to legislate, but to put the laws into effect in a much more concerted way. Yeah. But this, I say, is part of this moralizing religious agenda, which forms part of a much broader policy as well of trying to impose order on Roman law, order on Roman society, and Justinian's clear belief that whilst we often think of Roman law and the legislation of Roman emperors as being primarily rhetorical and symbolic, Justinian believes that you can reform society and reconstitute it on the basis of law.
So these are somewhat draconian measures, no? I mean, this is very, it's almost inflexible, but it seems, I remember when reading the book that it's almost like he's trying to not prove a point just to sake of prove a point, but to make a stand. That's just like you said, this isn't just theological or rhetorical or symbolic, but that this is pragmatic and this is a part of life, and here's how we have governing principles of how to do that. Is that, I mean, obviously there's a religious component, he's religious, but is it also a kind of um, a way of saying how we should have, in the sense of a society and a culture of rule of law, we're gonna have it this way through a lens of religion, that is Christianity. I mean, that was very intentional, right? It wasn't just okay for religious people. This was for society and culture at large.
Absolutely. And just as I said, I think in some ways we think too much in terms of Justinian trying to restore a lost Roman world. What he's really engaged in is an attempt to bring to completion the Christianization of the Roman state that had been initiated by Constantine and his heirs over a much slower and much more pragmatic process. And what he's engaged in, as I argue, is an attempt to effectively reconstitute the Roman state into something much more like the sort of confessional states we will encounter in the later medieval and early modern period, whereby the legal rights of the emperor's subjects at civil law will be determined by their officially reckoned degree of religious conformity. In one of his laws, he describes his empire as an orthodox republic. Orthodox state. This is central to his vision, and this is very important and very new. And this is also informed by his sense that the empire can only be successful in the military sphere, in the political sphere, in any sphere, if it has God's favor. In order to achieve God's favor, to win God's favor and secure it, he has to engage in the moral improvement and catharsis of his society as a whole.
I mean, there's almost a way of, yes, it's tough, and it's very kind of almost not authoritarian, but there is a kind of strong approach to it. But you almost can sort of respect it, of saying, well, he was trying to really, kind of walk the talk, and there's a kind of admiration. At least for me, it's like, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with it, but at the time, it's admirable that he was at least trying to really to do that.
Well, I think you have hardline elements in the Christian church, in the imperial church at this time, who look at what Justinian's doing and say, this is exactly what we've been waiting for. And what's in a sense interesting is that what we get reflected in Justinian's legislation is a lot of the rhetoric of the more hardline Christian moralists of the Roman church of this period. At the same time, to more conservative members of the Roman governing classes who have much more of a sort of a live and let live attitude, this is despotic. Justinian's breaking all the rules of how an emperor is meant to behave. Of course, this is a Christian empire. People are expected to pretend to be Christian. But you don't really question whether they're just pretending. You don't really send investigative officers around to work out if conversions are genuine or not. Let people just appear to conform. By seeking to go beyond that, Justinian is felt by many more conservative members of the Roman governing classes to be breaking the rules. And this is why in the writings of Procopius and others, he is regarded as an age of unprecedented tyranny. So it depends what side you're on, as it were, in these culture wars of the 6th century, which are very pronounced. Now, of course, he's also willing to be pragmatic in the sense that his policy agenda goes well beyond what is practicable, what is actually achievable in the context of a pre-industrial society. This is a form of totalitarianism without the machinery of a totalitarian state. And so, we can see him being much more pragmatic, and certainly there will be situations, contexts, where the size of the dissident congregations or the non-Christian communities on the ground will make it politically impossible for Justinian's laws to be meaningfully put into effect. He will negotiate with these communities when it's in his interest to do so. He will grant them exemptions from his legislation. But those exemptions that we see recorded in some of his laws only make sense against a broader background of attempted imposition. And it's that attempted imposition that really scandalizes more conservative elements of political society, and which I think really does mark his reign out from that of any of his predecessors.
Now, some people may not know this or associate it, and some people may only know or commonly know Justinian for a big big piece here, which is the Hagia Sofia, which is, obviously a absolutely beautiful structure in current day Istanbul, formerly known as Constantinople. I haven't been there yet. I'm very, very wanting to go there so bad. I'm assuming you've been. Have you been to the Hagia
I have,
Sophia?
and I'm going back there again, all being well on Sunday. Uh,
so lucky.
after I was finished speaking to you.
How, just as an aside here, I mean, how beautiful is it really in real life when you're in there and yeah, just describe it, I guess.
Well, I'm returning on Sunday for the first time since it's been restored to being a mosque. So it will be very different, I think, on this occasion in terms of the visibility of a lot of the Byzantine Christian decoration, which during the period when it was a museum was visible. So I can't really comment on what it looks like at the moment. So I haven't yet seen that. As a space, it is completely overpowering. And until the 16th century, it was the largest domed structure, to our knowledge, anywhere in the world. What even before it was restored as a mosque, the modern version, the modern viewer can't really appreciate is the extent to which, when Justinian had it built, it was really an extraordinary combination, not just of architecture in terms of this vast space with this enormous central dome, but also of lighting engineering and sound engineering that was meant to work in synergy with the imperial liturgy. A lot of the windows were blocked in over the course of the Byzantine and Ottoman period. The acoustics are changed when you have carpet and curtains for Muslim prayer and so on, and the covering of images. It's lost a lot of its internal luster as well as its external luster. The original was decorated with marble cladding, as it were, which would have caught the rays of the sun. So the effect today is very different to how it would originally have been viewed. Yeah,
that's very interesting. What was, the motivation for him building this, and then also other iconic structures for Christianity? Was this a type of I don't know, I don't want to say it in a kind of casual way, but was it a type of productive kind of propaganda? Is it this kind of way of saying, like, look at this, we need to have symbols, and these things are important? I guess what was the motivation for this specifically, but all other iconic structures that he had?
Very, very much so. The immediate background to the construction of Hagia Sophia was that Justin's relations with members of the senatorial aristocracy were pretty tense the moment he comes to the throne, made worse by his determination to tax them more effectively. And in the year 532, there was a major uprising of the population in Constantinople, partly funded, one suspects, by some of these senatorial interests, which tries to drive him from the throne. And we're told he almost takes flight, but is persuaded to stay by his wife, the indomitable Empress Theodora, with whom he really regards himself really as reigning the empire jointly. Now, during the course of those riots, much of the monumental centre of Constantinople is destroyed. So he has to rebuild. But he takes advantage of the destruction now to rebuild the monumental heart of Constantinople in the glorification of himself, his empress, the regime, and God. And the point with his reconstructed Hagia Sophia is that it is meant on one level to surpass a church that had been recently built by a member of one of these great aristocratic interests he'd come into conflict with. There'd been earlier a great church built by an aristocratic woman called Anicia Juliana, called St. Polyeuctus. On one level, Hagia Sophia is meant to now dwarf St. Polyeuctus and put the architectural ambitions of the Constantinopolitan aristocracy in their place. It is meant to dominate the heart of the city and to draw the minds of his subjects to the beneficent nature of his rule and the extent to which this is a city which he regards to be under divine protection. At the same time, both in response to the Nika riots and as we call those riots, and the destruction they cause, and more generally, Justinian, more than any emperor before him, invests very heavily in church building across the landscape of Constantinople, the townscape of Constantinople. Previously, emperors had tended to give money to the church, and the church then built churches. Emperors themselves tended to invest in more secular monuments. With Justinian, we see a major shift towards church building in terms of works commissioned by the emperor. And this is part of an attempt to, as I say, sort of as it were, bring Constantine's work to completion, to more fully Christianize the landscape, and to impose the emperor's personality upon it. There was a brilliant American Byzantine architectural historian who passed away recently, Robert Oosterhout, who describes how what Justinian effectively is doing is turning the city of Constantine into the city of Justinian. And I think that sums it up very nicely.
It's very nicely said. Yeah. Wow. Yes, it's very, very interesting. I always wonder when you see these big, structures, the things that last for centuries afterwards, millennia afterwards. What's the kind of future planning there of when people you see, you go to different countries and you see cathedrals and things like that, and it's this is going to be here 1,500 years from now, and I want to make sure people know who built this, and then why this. There's this interesting kind of perspective or future kind of acclaim as well, I would have to imagine. No?
Well, also, I think what's extraordinary is, I say, Justinian's always in a hurry. This is true in his legal works, it's true in his building works as well. And the construction of Hagia Sophia is regarded by contemporaries as nearly miraculous. And it's regarded as miraculous in two terms, in two respects. First of all, its sheer scale. No one had ever tried to build a domed structure of this scale before, which poses enormous architectural and engineering challenges. The internal height was equivalent to a 15-story building. Secondly, and the design was so audacious that later sources regarded it as having been revealed to the emperor by an angel. And secondly, it's just extraordinary speed. We think about the centuries it would sometimes take in the medieval West to build a cathedral. Well, this is completed in pretty much in under 5 years, effectively. The scale of the construction is quite remarkable, and the speed of it even more so.
Yeah. That's a whole other achievement even in itself. So it's quite remarkable. So as he's moving along through his reign, and he starts to, in the book, you have this part of the book is about expansion. You mentioned them earlier, the Vandals. You talk about Carthage, and you talk about his movement into Africa in 534. Could you talk about this part of his reign, with going into Africa, then he goes into Italy, and also some of the other groups that he was interacting with, such as the Vandals and others?
Yeah, so what you've had, as I said, over the course of the 5th century is a fragmentation of the Roman Empire in the West, and the emergence of a series of autonomous kingdoms, primarily under barbarian rule. Some of these kingdoms sort of continue to pay lip service to the idea of the ongoing sovereignty and authority of the emperor emanating from Constantinople, but many of them don't. And from a Constantinopolitan perspective, the most important of these successor kingdoms will be the Goths, who establish themselves in Italy, ruling in the imperial heartlands there, dominating, controlling Rome, and the Vandals in Africa. The Vandals establishing themselves there over the course of the 530s and 540s. The point with Africa being that it had been the wealthiest province of the Western Roman Empire, very locked into patterns of Mediterranean trade, and the Vandals also control many of the islands of the central and western Mediterranean, allowing them to tax and control a lot of those trade routes. In both Italy and Africa, the Goths and the Vandals, respectively, are also devotees of the theology of the 4th century churchman Arius, who had been condemned as a heretic in Constantinople. So these barbarian regimes in Africa and Italy are regarded as, in a sense, doubly insulting from the perspective of Justinian and his regime. This is rightly Roman territory, but ruled over by heretics. Now, Justinian doesn't come to the throne, I don't think, with any predetermined plan to recreate and reconquer the Roman territories in the West as a whole. But he is ideologically predisposed to intervene should circumstances permit. Now, these societies that are taking shape in the West in the 5th and 6th centuries are very military societies. They're very king-focused societies. And the king in these societies is meant to be primarily a military leader. So if you have a king at the apex of the society who seems to be militarily ineffective, or if you have a struggle for power at the apex of these societies in terms of a disputed succession, they become very vulnerable, very prone to attack. And what happens effectively is that in, first of all, Vandal Africa in the early 530s, and then in Italy in the mid 530s, you have a series of internal power disputes and disputed successions which open the way to military intervention. First of all in Africa, then in Italy, and then in the 550s, Justinian will intervene in Spain, in the so-called Visigothic kingdom there, very much in parallel circumstances. You have a struggle for power in Spain, a disputed succession, rival claimants to the throne. The next thing you know, imperial armies are being sent over to try to establish an imperial enclave. So in Africa in the 530s, in 533, in Italy in 535, then in Spain in the 550s, you get this opportunistic imperialism whereby Justinian takes advantage of these political crises in these different kingdoms to try to reestablish imperial control.
How much of this, we talked about it earlier, so I'm going to kind of link it here at this point. So when he's starting out on his rise to be an emperor, he was, a soldier. He was, having this command. At this point, during his campaigns in Africa and Italy, how much of that do you think it was kind of in the workings of how he wanted to approach these things, how he wanted to take advantage of some of the local political conflicts? How much of it, I guess, tactically or ways in which he was trying to formulate this, where he was trying to decisively get at these places? How much of that was in the mix, or was it just him being emperor already and he was using that, or both of it? What do you kind of think about the ways in which he kind of went about doing this?
I think some of this probably goes back to his uncle Justin. I think some members of the Constantinopolitan elite, the Byzantine elite, the Roman elite, call them what you like, in the early 6th century, probably don't care that much about what's happened in the West. If you're a landowner whose estates are primarily in Syria, it's the Persians you most care about. You might not even really understand what's happened in Italy or North Africa. You might think these kings there are sort of Roman client kings. I think that other elements of the Byzantine elite and the establishment are much more concerned about it. And I think that in particular, men of military background who come from the Western Balkans and who have seen the ravages of barbarian attack in the mid-5th century, like Justin, are going to be much more anti-barbarian and much more ideologically predisposed to intervene in the West militarily if they get the chance. I mean, I think it's important we see a hardening of attitudes and a growing readiness to destabilize relations in the West between Romans and non-Romans from the reign of Justin onwards. So I think there's an element of continuity there. I think it's part of the milieu in which Justinian is being raised, of these so-called Illyrian officers and soldiers who are going to be a bit more anti-barbarian and a bit more likely to intervene. That having been said, I think it's also important that Justinian has quite a connected view of the empire as a whole, that he, as with many of the emperors before him, still has this core sense that whilst there are opportunities for expansion to the West, should circumstances allow, the real threat comes from the East. And so I think he's very careful to try to ensure that these Western campaigns are never at the expense of the defences of the Eastern provinces. And I think this is something that people sometimes get wrong. That we have the armies that he sends west aren't small, but we have no evidence for any substantial reallocation of large numbers of troops from the eastern frontier to the west. And the complaint of Justinian's generals in the West will always be that he never quite sends them enough troops. And if he did, the campaign in Italy, for example, could have been brought to a conclusion rather more rapidly.
It's very, very interesting. So it's interesting how sometimes, in an American context, sometimes we used to have these ideas of, well, how does a general, then how is he a president or how does he govern? And obviously, much different, but it's always interesting how people, when you're an emperor of a whole empire, you're wearing different hats, and some you'll do well, and others you won't do as well. And so it's interesting to see him as, looking at these kind of military ideas and how he wants to organize things, who he's putting in these certain theaters, et cetera. It's very, very, very interesting.
And he doesn't, I mean, in general, he isn't someone who likes to devolve. He has trouble letting go.
Mm.
But I think it's very important that he's forged during his time as a general. Clearly, this relationship with this soldier Belisarius, whom he appoints as a general early on in his reign, and he entrusts the campaigns in first of all Africa and then Italy to Belisarius. And when he sends Belisarius west, I think he's entrusting Belisarius with quite a loose mandate, trusting him enough to be able to sort of develop the levels of imperial ambition and the scale of ambition in the light of what Belisarius encounters on the ground.
Mm.
So should resistance be tough, you pretend you're just going to Africa to punish the Vandal regime for deposing the king whom Justinian had previously acknowledged. But if you find that actually their resistance isn't up to much, then you can go for a more full-blown intervention, leading ultimately to a takeover, which is what he achieves in Africa. And again, I think we see in Italy evidence for Belisarius being rather more territorial and aggressive than some of Justinian's diplomats liked or wanted him to be.
Yeah. So, kind of more on the psychological piece you mentioned in the book, Justinian was kind of known as the sleepless emperor. Right? He was always doing so many things. So where do you think he got all this energy as his reign continues? How do we start to see some of the effects of the laws that he has started to instantiate, whether the religious laws or whether there are other types of laws that he's placed in empire? Where do we start to see the impact of the effects there, and more so of where he's getting all of this energy to continue to do all of these things?
I think once again here it's a question of personality and stamina and nature of the man. I think it's important that both his own propaganda and the writings of his critics agree that he is a workaholic. So the historian Procopius satirizes this in terms of saying, he must be a demon because other people need to go to sleep and to eat, but he's always pacing the palace late at night. His legislation addresses almost every aspect of life as lived in 6th century Constantinople, with a real focus on trying to raise tax revenues, making the tax system more efficient, making the legal system speedier and more efficient, cracking down on corruption and cracking down on, as I said, religious dissidents. But also, I think, he's being encouraged by his wife. And the political alliance and the personal alliance between Justinian and the Empress Theodora is really important and really profound, such that as he presents their rule until her death in the year 548, in many ways as a period of joint rule. He expressly acknowledges in his legislation that he consults her on important laws, and she can be seen to have lobbied him in certain respects on legislation, particularly to improve the lot of women and vulnerable girls. She herself having come from seemingly very lowly origins, and as both pro and anti-Theodora sources agree, probably having spent the early part of her life certainly as an actress and possibly as a prostitute.
Mm. Was that common for there to be a kind of, your wife to kind of, in his mind, to say that we're co-leading the empire? Was that a common thing, or how unique, I guess, was that dynamic?
It's in the 5th century, empresses in Constantinople had periodically been quite influential, but no one is accorded the sort of political status and role that Justinian accords to Theodora. Mm. And likewise, throughout Justinian is attempting to build up a personality cult. He founds cities which he names after himself. He's not the only person to do that. He has his name put up in inscriptions all over the place. He names new governmental offices after himself. But we look in Hagia Sophia, he's putting up his monogram all over the cathedral. But he's putting his wife's up too. Mm. He's founding cities named after himself. He's founding cities named after her too. I say he makes imperial governors swear a personal oath of loyalty, not just to him, but also to his wife. That is really very unusual. And that, again, really aggravates and alienates conservative critics who regard that sort of thing as really very un-Roman.
Interesting. He must have just had like an unshakable bond and must have trusted her. I mean, there has to be motivations for that. I mean, he must have really, had this like, deep intimacy and connection with her to put that much.
Well, one thing I think he's inherited from his uncle is a romantic streak. Again, Justinian is raised in the palace. All our sources agree that one thing that he and his uncle have in common is their good looks. He's good looking, he's well connected, he's successful. He could have got himself a very posh bride. Instead, he falls in love in middle age with this woman who is 10 years younger than himself, but no spring chicken when they get together, who's had a very disreputable past, who arrives in Constantinople with an illegitimate daughter, though she seems to have become very religious, as it were, prior to her arrival there. And they forge a very close bond. They live together prior to getting married. The main reason for this seems to be that his aunt, the Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife, the ex-slave girl, can't stand Theodora, doesn't like her, wants Justinian to have a proper, probably posh Roman bride, and he really has to wait until his aunt dies before they can get married. And also because Theodora has had this disreputable past, by this point Justinian is a senator, she's been at best an actress, he has to get his uncle to change the law in order for their marriage to be made legal. All of this, I think, really conveys his extraordinary devotion to this woman.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely so. I mean, that's it's quite incredible, and I think it's nice that we have this kind of look into their kind of dynamics. I think that's very helpful. I guess the last question I have on this piece, I mean, we've talked about it a lot, so I don't want to belabor it, but you mentioned how has Justinian transformed the Roman Empire into a confessional state? So this is kind of back on the religious components here. I guess the question I have here is a lot of these religious laws, a lot of punishment for dissidents, things like that, for pagans. But how did people receive him? How did they receive all these laws? Whether they're like these like we don't want to do this, or this is too far, or what was it? Or they're just like, yes, we're going to do anything you say. Like, what was this confessional state that you mentioned during the middle to latter, I guess, part of his reign there?
So just to clarify what it is consisting of in terms of his legislation, what he's trying to do, as I say, he makes it illegal not only to perform pagan rites, but even to be a pagan, ordering they convert, go into exile, or die. With his uncle, he has banned non-Christians and heretics from holding any military or governmental post, and he bans them from teaching. Strictly speaking, he ordains that only Orthodox Christian heirs could inherit property under the full protection of the law. So this is giving bickering relatives fighting over inheritances an incentive to convert. He says in, I think, a law that gives one a sense of how brutal these relations could be on the ground. He passes a law that even upper-class heretics and Jews who would previously have been immune from such activities can be beaten up by state officials. And he has government officials being sent around the empire to hunt down pagans, to hunt down heretics, and to investigate people's religious stance. Now, of course, there would have been a great deal of regional variation in this, as I've said earlier. But I think what we see is a concerted effort to demoralize, to intimidate, and cajole such groups into religious conformity. No emperor had acted in so harsh a way as Justinian. Now, of course, you will have the imposition of the law on the ground requires the cooperation of local office holders, local officials, local judges, local governors, local bishops. Some of these officials will be men who share the mindset of Procopius, but this is all very un-Roman, and they'll sort of try to let people get away with their non-conformity. There's also a long-standing tradition in the Roman world that if there's a law you don't like, you bribe someone to look the other way. Right? You bribe governors or bishops to look the other way, to leave you alone. There's going to be a lot of that going on. But it does mean in those localities and those circumstances where the ambitions of the emperor align with the ideological, political, and religious stance of the local governor or the local bishop, then these laws can be put into effect in a very draconian way. So we have, for example, an inscription from the city of Sardis detailing the punishment of pagans who have been arrested and tried just during Justinian's reign. As I say, it's but this idea that the more religiously orthodox you are, the greater your legal rights are, is I think very important, and that will be a major inheritance. In some ways, it will even be an influence on early Islamic law, where in a sense, what will happen is in early Islam is that the difference will be that the Orthodox Christians, instead of being at the apex of the system, will be one of the relatively marginalized groups. Sort of inverted.
Yeah, it's very, very, very fascinating how that kind of plays out. So, kind of towards the end of his reign, in the 40s, 540s, he has plague and war and many things like this that are occurring. How did he deal with that, and what kind of an impact did that have on him?
I think it's very important to appreciate. We sort of, because we know about the Black Death and things, we sort of imagine the medieval past as being always filled with these pandemics, but nothing could have prepared either the empire or the emperor for the bubonic plague which struck in the 540s. No previous pandemic of this scale or intensity has struck the empire in the past, and we shouldn't underestimate its possible ramifications. Until the development of modern medicine, bubonic plague was one of the deadliest diseases known to humanity. But despite that, what I think is really interesting is that the initial response to Justinian and his ministers in that crucial period from the advent of the plague in 541 to 2 down to about 546 was really very impressive. And despite the disorientating circumstances in which they found themselves, we see a series of concerted, crisis-driven measures aimed at containing the initial ravages of the disease and its impact. The organisation of mass graves in Constantinople to get rid of the dead, attempts to impose price and wage control to stop shortages of labour and the breakdown of the supply system from leading to the collapse of the urban economies of the empire, the introduction of new legal courts to allow bankers to pursue the debtors of people who have died in the plague, currency reforms to try to address short-term crises in imperial income due to taxpayers dying at a time when the expenditure required of the state would have remained at least constant. These are, I think, a series of remarkably well-considered measures from those years of 542 to 546 that probably meant that although, of course, the empire suffered a very major financial crisis by virtue of the advent of the bubonic plague and its subsequent recurrences, what we don't have is a total collapse of a sort that might have been possible. I think it gets harder once we move, as we start getting repeated recurrences of the plague, and the problems caused by it become cumulative. I think the real problems caused by the plague will come to the fore more then from the late 540s, the 550s, into the 560s. Likewise, it's going to cause major problems in terms of military recruitment and manpower. In a recent book on the Byzantine army, Anthony Kaldelis has acknowledged that shortages caused by the plague are probably responsible for a military weakening of the empire as you move into the later 6th century. And that's important because Anthony's been quite sceptical about aspects of the plague in the past. Again, what we see is, I think, genuine evidence for troop shortages causing problems at a time when the empire is having to face simultaneous warfare to both east and west, which is having to do increasingly in the 540s, but also Justinian's recruiting sergeants trying to address this by going on major recruitment drives, trying to stop landowners from keeping soldiers in their estates to beat up their peasants and so on. So we see the empire and his administrators straining every nerve to try to hold this system together. And I think in many respects they do remarkably well. And I think we have to be careful not to assume that just because the empire does sort of hold together, that the plague wasn't very severe and very serious. I think really the way in which the empire holds together is more to do with the remarkable efforts of Justinian and his regime, rather than to do with the nature of the disease itself, which we should take very seriously.
Yeah, well, especially when you're talking about it in a totally different time period where, what were they, how were they able to contain this? Or what were they thinking about it? Obviously very far from modern medicine. But it's interesting though that he he has some personal and political losses, and then the military power begins to dwindle. So maybe some of this was from the plague, but how did he deal with these personal political losses and then starting to lose some of the military might?
Yes, we're told that he himself is recorded to have been struck by the plague, that he recovers from it, and this might have taken a physical and psychological toll. There's also a religious response to the plague, whereby it makes him even more determined to try to secure divine favour. He becomes even more theological in focus and even more determined to root out immorality. So I think that it intensifies that aspect of his reign. So there's the plague aspect, and then in 548, as I mentioned earlier, Theodora dies. And this too, I think, seems to have taken some of the wind out of his sails. And certainly it seems to have elicited anxieties on the part of some of his commanders in the West that the emperor's sort of lost interest in the Italian campaign. We have a real stiffening of Gothic resistance at this time. But although I think the emperor's interests and focus becomes even more theological and even more religious by virtue of both the plague and the death of his wife, we do see him and those around him starting to regain composure and focus in the end, such that, and this is again something I think is overlooked. I think often people think of a period of great creativity and expansion early in the reign, brought to an end by the plague, then it's all downhill. It's not as simple as that. In the 550s, we see a number of really important innovations and adventures, such as the sending of the army to Spain that I mentioned, and a really fascinating and remarkable act of industrial espionage, whereby Justinian's agents will steal the lucrative secret of silk production from the East. And the Byzantine silk industry will then become a major source of imperial revenues. Down into the 560s, we also see a really important expansion and consolidation of the empire's control in the Caucasus. So again, this is a regime where even late in his reign, even as he's getting old, even after the death of his wife, he does regain composure and he is capable still of a very targeted and effective interventions.
And yet you do mention that there was some isolation that he experienced late in his life. That he did have some losses and he was isolated. What do you make of that, especially towards the time when he dies?
Yes, I think
What do you think of that?
I think later in life he does become more isolated. He becomes more paranoid. He's got reason to be paranoid, given that there are members of courtly society and the senatorial elite are constantly plotting against him, and there are assassination attempts down into the 560s. I think, like a lot of old men, he prefers to surround himself with men and courtiers of his own generation,
Sure.
whom he found it easier to understand and whom he was more inclined to trust. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think he starts to fall ill in the 560s. He's taken almost a clearly convalescence trips outside of the imperial city, which are justified to political society in Constantinople through all sorts of means. But at the end of the day, despite all of the plots against him, despite all the machinations, despite having suffered bubonic plague, at the end of the day, he dies a very old man, aged about 83, probably just of old age, drawing to a close one of the 3 longest reigns in the entirety of Roman history.
Yeah, it's. I mean, look, listen. I mean, 83 is old by today's standards. By those standards, I mean, he was basically, could have been 300 years old. I mean, 83 is long.
One of the great, his longevity astounds his admirers and enormously demoralizes his opponents.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So, I guess the last question I have for you here is, what is, I guess, the legacy of Justinian? I mean, again, as I said in the beginning, I mean, you've written a fabulous book, really giving him due credit. And I guess, what is it that you want people to know, most importantly, about Justinian? Why he's important? Why we should still study him and learn about his life, and the impact that he's had on human history and civilization.
Well, I think we have a tendency, as I say, by virtue of this dependence on the perspective of Procopius and Procopius's military narratives and the Western reconquests, to judge Justinian's legacy in terms of what happens to those Western reconquests after his reign. These territories will mostly be lost relatively rapidly in the context of a rearticulation and reconfiguration of the world around Byzantium. And so Justinian's often thought of as a failure. But as I tried to emphasize in the book, Justinian's chief priorities had really always been in the field of law and in the field of religion. And in those two spheres, his legacy would endure. At the end of the day, Roman law, as it would be transmitted to the Middle Ages, and in the form which would serve as the basis for the legal systems that would operate across the entirety of Europe until the age of Napoleon and much of the world beyond it, was Roman law, civil law, as defined by Justinian and his legal commissioners. So that legal legacy is immense. And there's also a legal legacy to the world of Islam as well. Again, it is in the form that Justinian's theologians and the emperor and his court define Christian orthodoxy, that Christianity will be received to both East and West in the early Middle Ages. But more fundamentally, in terms of his Western legacy, the vision Justinian has of a Christian society regulated and presided over by an active and pious monarch will not simply come to serve as the heart of Byzantine ideology in the centuries ahead, but will also serve as the core and kernel ideological framework of Western Latin Christendom as it will take shape in the centuries ahead, where clerical authorities and royal authorities will also crack down on religious dissidents and minorities, doing so inspired by legislation that had been issued by Justinian. So Justinian will provide the framework for the development of Western Christendom moving forward. But in both the Muslim world and the Christian world, his model of active and energetic rulership across so long a reign will come to redefine what it means to rule. And so he will emerge as a model of good rulership to Byzantine emperors, medieval kings, Muslim caliphs, and sultans. I think it's also worth bearing in mind beyond that, his legacy in the cultural sphere, not only in terms of delineating the confessional state, which would then have a new lease of life in late medieval and early modern Europe, and which will play a fundamental part to the development of the modern state, but also even in terms of fields as diverse as architecture. Justinian's building projects in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Apostles, will become the model for prestige church building throughout the Christian world. Also, because Hagia Sophia is turned into a mosque, and a prestigious mosque by the Ottoman authorities, it will become the model for prestigious mosque building across the entirety of the Ottoman Empire in Islam and way beyond. So what we have here is an emperor who redefines what it is to rule, redefines the legal and religious legacy of the Roman Empire, which will inform the shaping of societies down to the modern day, and even leaves an imprint on the physical monuments around us in terms of the places of worship which we see or worship in or encounter.
Yeah, this is very well said. The book is called Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint. This is through the wonderful Basic Books. This is out October. Peter, this was so much fun. I greatly enjoyed this. I read your book earlier in the summer, and I really loved it. And so I was very excited to talk with you. Is there any place you'd like to point people to, either for your work or socially, or for the book itself, anywhere in particular you want to point people to?
First of all, thank you again for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it. There's a huge amount of really good work being written on Byzantium at the moment. So if you get interested in this topic by virtue of either this podcast or by reading the book, I would point you to, for example, there's a really good now single volume history of Byzantium written by Anthony Kaldelis in 1,000 pages. That will give you a new vision of the empire as a whole. I don't agree with all of it, but I think it's a terrific book. Travel, try to visit these places when you get the chance. Nothing brings this world to life more than actually visiting the locations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, Peter, this is so much fun. I really, really enjoyed this. I can't say enough thanks for you coming on. It was really, really valuable for me, and so I wish you all the best.
Great. Thank you so much.